Acts chapter 9, the author Luke details how Saul of Tarsus went from following in the Jewish tradition of the Pharisees to following Jesus as not just his rabbi, but his Messiah. Verse 1 and 2 tells us that Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. This is often hard for modern Christians in the Western world to wrap their minds around, but followers of Jesus were initially persecuted for either blasphemy by followers of the Hebrew God, or they were persecuted for atheism by those who worshipped the Roman God. On the one hand, they were proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God, which, if they were wrong about this claim, as many Jewish people thought they were, then they were guilty of blaspheming against the holy name of God. The punishment for this would be death. Then, on the other hand, from the perspective of those who worshipped the Roman gods, Christians were considered atheists because they didn't believe in or worship the whole pantheon of gods that they believed in and worshipped. Both of these accusations led to intense persecution for Christians. And here in the text, we see the persecution coming from people within, namely Saul, who is appealing to the high priest to go arrest Christians. From Saul's perspective, this wasn't just a personal quest. This was a mission from God. He was a devout man who had certainty in what he believed. He was going to follow it to its logical conclusion. For someone like Paul, who was highly educated in the Hebrew scriptures, he would have known what the book of Leviticus said. For example, take the blasphemer outside the camp. Those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them. So based on this passage, Saul, amongst many others, would have concluded that Christians were guilty of blasphemy and should therefore be put to death by being stoned by an assembly of people who would proceed to collectively throw giant rocks at the blasphemer until they died. Saul in particular would have been prone to taking this literally because Pharisees believed that the reason they, as the Jewish people, had been experiencing oppression from one empire after the next because they had failed to follow the law of Moses perfectly. The solution then to all of their woes was to make sure these commands, including the stoning of blasphemers, were followed. In early book of Acts, we see Saul present for such a thing at the death of Christianity's first martyr, Stephen. And now he's seeking the death of more Christians due to his strong conviction rooted in the scriptures and in his tradition of interpretation as a Pharisee. But all these convictions are quickly thrown into jeopardy when Saul experiences something that shatters his entire worldview. As Saul neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." From there, Saul does go into the city. He meets a Christian man named Ananias who heals him. And Saul ultimately changes his entire way of thinking about things as he baptizes in the name of Christ. Now you can imagine the huge question from both Pharisees and Christians alike. Why would Saul suddenly abandon his certainty, his tradition, and change his convictions and beliefs? And the answer is both simple and quite complex. Saul experienced something that challenged everything he knew to be true. Saul encountered the risen Christ in all his divinity, and it showed his interpretation of the scriptures to be misguided. Not only did this mean to Saul that Jesus was the Messiah that he had been waiting for and the Son of God, But this also meant that everything Jesus taught must now be taken seriously by Saul as the Word of God. This meant that Saul had to return to all of the scriptures that he thought he knew so well, and he had to reinterpret them in light of the life, ministry, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. This is essentially what Saul goes on to do. The majority of the New Testament are his writings to various churches as he tries to understand the story of the Hebrew Scriptures in light of this experience he had on the road to Damascus. You can imagine the conversations that the Pharisees had in response to this. You can imagine how frustrated they must have been when Saul, small people, suddenly turned to blasphemy and interpreted the scriptures in ways that they thought were absurd. Yet Saul couldn't help but do so in order to get a sense of what he experienced in the risen Christ. We see Paul go from all to believing that Christians are raised for their beliefs. He went from believing that one should kill their enemies to believing that a Christian should love their enemies. His response is no longer to appeal to the priest, but to confirmation. Many Christians can report experiencing something along these lines, whether before they embraced Christ or even after. Perhaps there was some experience that caused them to embrace Jesus and all that entails. Or perhaps there was something that they experienced after beginning to follow Jesus that caused them to question if what their pastor told them was true. When these sorts of events happen after following Jesus for a while, it causes us as Christians to return to the scriptures and our tradition and seek to reinterpret it as Saul did in light of his experience. In these cases, those who haven't experienced the same things might look at their fellow person of faith in condemnation and confusion. They might even assume they've abandoned the faith. This was definitely true in the case of Saul. He felt like he was leaning deeper into his Jewish faith and upbringing because, according to his experience, he felt convinced that he had now found the Messiah he had longed for so long. Yet his fellow Pharisees likely grieved that Saul, despite the prodigy that he was, had abandoned the faith. In the same way, many Christians today are encountering experiences that are causing them to rethink how they had previously interpreted the scriptures and their tradition. In my case, I used to think that gay people were living lives of sin. Yet when I was in high school, one of my close family friends came out of the closet, and I began to kind of say to myself, like, there's no way that he is living in sin. This close family friend of mine was one of the kindest, most loving, dare I say, Christ-like people I knew. And so the suggestion that he was living a life of sin did not seem consistent with the gospel of Jesus. This experience, it caused me to reinterpret my scriptures and my tradition. And many might look upon this as me abandoning my faith. But from my perspective, I have come to embrace a more Christ-like way of viewing and interacting with those around me. Regardless of gender or sexuality, perhaps you too have experienced something in this regard that has caused you to rethink how you were taught to view God and people. So let's continue this journey together as we seek to reinterpret the scriptures in light of our experiences.